Hello, my darlings. Mother Raven here with another Folklore Thursday. I'm bringing you some more stories from Charles Skinner today. These more from the Rockies. I will start with Riders of the Desert. Among the sandstone columns of the Colorado foothills stood the lodge of Tottengoro, first falling thunder. Though swift in the chase and brave in battle, he seldom went abroad with neighboring tribes, for he was happy in the society of his wife, Cicana, the bird. To sell beaver and wild sheep skins, he often went with her to a post on the New Mexico frontier, and it was while at this fort that a Spanish trader saw the pretty Cicana and determined to win her. Sent the native on a mission into the heart of the mountains, with a promise that she should rest securely at the settlement until his return. On his way, Tottengoro stopped at the spring in Manitou, and after drinking, he cast beads and wampum into the well in oblation to its deity. The offering was flung out by the bubbling water, and as he stared, distressed at this unwelcome omen, a picture formed on the surface. The anguished features of Cicana. He ran to his horse, galloped away, and paused, neither for rest nor food until he reached the post. The Spaniard was gone. Turning then to the foothills, he urged his jaded horse towards his cabin, and arriving one bright morning, flushed with joy to see his wife before his door and hear her singing. When he spoke, she looked up carelessly and resumed her song. She did not know him. Reason was gone. It was his cry of rage and grief when, from her babbling, Tottengoro learned of the Spaniard's treachery. That brought the wandering mind back for an instant. Looking at her husband with a strange surprise and pain, she plucked the knife from his belt before he could realize her purpose. She had thrust it into her heart and had fallen dead at his feet. For hours he stood there in stupefaction, but the stolid native nature soon resumed its sway. Setting his lodge in order and feeding his horse, he wrapped Cicana's body in buffalo skin, then slept through the night in sheer exhaustion. 2 nights afterward, the Indian stood in the shadow of a room in the trading fort and watched the Spaniard as he lay sleeping. Nobody knew how he got past the guard. In the small hours, the trader was roused by the strain of a belt across his mouth, and leaping up to fling it off, he felt the tug of a lariat at his throat. His struggles were useless. In a few moments, he was bound, hand and foot. Lifting some strips of bark from the low roof, Tottengoro pushed the Spaniard through the aperture and lowered him to the ground, outside the enclosure of which the house formed part. Then, at the embers of a fire, he kindled an arrow wrapped in the down of cottonwood and shot it into a haystack in the court. In the smoke and confusion thus made, his own escape was unseen, save by a guardsman drowsily pacing his beat outside the square of buildings. The sentinel would have given alarm had not the native pounced on him like a panther and laid him dead with a knife stroke. Catching up the Spaniard, the native tied him to the back of a horse and set off beside him. Thus they journeyed until they came to his lodge, where he released the trader from his horse and fed him, but kept his hands and legs hard bound, and paid no attention to his questions and his appeals for liberty. Tying a strong and half-trained horse at his door, Tottengoro placed a wooden saddle on him, cutting off the Spaniard's clothes and putting him astride the beast. After he had fastened him to the seat with deerskin thongs, he took Cicana's corpse from its wrapping and tied it to his prisoner, face to face. Then, loosing the horse, which was plunging and snorting to be rid of its burden, saw him rush off on the limitless desert, and followed on his own strong steed. At first the Spaniard fainted. On recovering, he struggled to get free, but his struggles only brought him closer to the ghastly thing before him. Noonday heat covered him with sweat, and blood dripped from the wells that cords cut in his flesh. At night he froze, uncovered in the chill air. And, if for an instant his eyes closed in sleep, a curse yelled in his ear, awoke him. Tottengoro gave him drink from time to time, but never food. And so they rode for days. At last, hunger overbore his loathing, and sinking his teeth into the dead flesh before him, he feasted like a ghoul. Still they rode, Tottengoro never far from his victim, on whose suffering he gloated, until a gibbering cry told him that the Spaniard had gone mad. Then, and not till then, he drew rein and watched the horse, with its dead and manic riders, until they disappeared in the yellow void. He turned away, but never more sought his home. To and fro, through the brush, the sand, the alkali of the plains, go the ghost riders forever. The Death Waltz. Years ago, when all beyond the Missouri was a waste, the military post at Fort Union, New Mexico, was the only spot for miles around where any of the graces of social life could be discovered. Among the ladies at the post was a certain young lady, the sister-in-law of a captain, who enjoyed the variety and spice of adventure to be found there, and enjoyed, too, the homage that the young officers paid her, for women who could be loved or liked were not many in that wild country, or so they thought. A young lieutenant proved especially susceptible to her charms, and devoted himself to her in the hopes that he would ultimately win her hand. His experience with the world was not large enough to enable him to distinguish between the womanly woman and the coquette. One day messengers came dashing into the fort with news of an Apache outbreak, and a detachment was ordered to chase and punish the marauding Indians. The lieutenant was put in command of the expedition, but before starting he confided his love to the young woman, who not only acknowledged that she returned his affection, but promised that if the fortune of war deprived him of life, she would never marry another. As he bade her goodbye, he was heard to say, "That is well. Nobody else shall have you. I will come back and make my claim." In a few days, the detachment came back, but the lieutenant was missing. It was noted that the bride-elect grieved but little for him, and nobody was surprised when she announced her intention of marrying a young man from the East. The wedding day arrived. All was gaiety at the post, and in the evening, the mess room was decorated for a ball. As the dance was in full swing, a door flew open with a bang, letting in a draft of air that made the candles burn dim. And a strange cry, unlike that of any human creature, sounded through the house. All eyes turned to the door. In it stood the swollen body of a dead man, dressed in the stained uniform of an officer. The temple was marked by a hatchet gash. The scalp was gone. The eyes were wide open and burned with a terrible light. Walking to the bride, the body drew her from the arms of her husband, who, like the rest of the company, stood in a trance, without the power of motion, and clasping her to its bosom began a waltz. The musicians, who afterward declared that they did not know what they were doing, struck up a demonic dance. and the couple spun around and around, the woman growing paler and paler, until at last the fallen jaw and staring eyes showed that life was also extinct in her. The dead man allowed her to sink to the floor, stood over her for a moment, wrung his hands as he sounded his fearful cry again, then vanished through the door. A few days after, a troop of soldiers who had been to the scene of the Apache encounter returned with the body of the lieutenant. The coming of the Navajo. Many fantastic accounts from the origin of man are found among the Native Americans. The Onondagas say the natives are made from red earth, and the white man from sea foam. Flesh-making clay is seen in the precipitous bank of the ravine west of Onondaga Valley, where at night the fairies, little fellows, sport and slide. Among others, the Noah legend finds a parallel. Several tribes claim to have emerged from the interior of the earth. The Oneidas point at a hill near the falls of Oswego River, New York, as their birthplace. The Wichita rose from the rocks about Red River. Creeks from a knoll in the valley of Big Black River in the Natchez country, where dwelt the Master of Breath. The Aztecs were one of 7 tribes that came out of the 7 caverns of Aztlan, or place of the heron, and the Navajos believed they emerged at a place known to them in the Navajo Mountains. In the underworld, the Navajo were happy, for they had everything they could wish. There was no excess of heat or cold. Trees and flowers grew everywhere, and the day was marked by a bright cloud that arose in the east, while a black cloud came out of the west, made it night. Here they lived for centuries, and might have been there to this day, had not one of the tribe found an opening in the earth that led to some place unknown. He told of it to the whole tribe. They set off up the passage to see where it led, and after long and weary climbing, the surface was reached. Pleased with the novelty of their surroundings, they settled here. But on the 4th day after their arrival, their queen disappeared. Their search for her was unavailing until some of the men came to the mouth of the tunnel by which they had reached the upper land. When looking down, they saw their queen combing her long black locks. She told them that she was dead and that her people could go to her only after death, but that they would be happy in their old home. With that, the earth shut together, and the place has never since been opened to the eyes of mortals. Soon came the cannibal giants who ravished the desert lands and destroyed all of the tribe but 4 small families, these having found a refuge in a deep canyon of the Navajo Mountains. From their retreat they could see a beam of light shining from one of the hills around them, and on ascending to the place, they found a beautiful girl babe. As this child grew to womanhood under their care, her charms attracted the great Manitou that rides on a white horse and carries the sun for a shield. He wooed and married her, and their children slew the giants that had destroyed the Navajo. After a time, the Manitou carried his wife to his floating palace in the western water, which has since been her home. To her the prayers of the people are addressed, and 12 immortal bears their petition to her throne. The Phantom Train of Marshal Pass. Soon after the rails were laid across Marshal Pass, Colorado, where they go over a height of 12,000 feet above the sea, An old engineer named Nelson Edwards was assigned to a train. He had traveled the road with passengers behind him for a couple of months and met with no accident. But one night, as he set off for the divide, he fancied that the silence was deeper, the canyon darker, and the air frostier than usual. A defective rail and an unsafe bridge had been reported that morning, and he began the long ascent with some misgivings. As he left the first line of snow sheds, he heard a whistle echoing somewhere among the ice and rocks, and at the same time, the gong in his cab sounded, and he applied the brakes. The conductor ran up and asked, "What did you stop for? Why did you signal the stop?" "I gave no signal." "Pull her open and light out. We've got to pass number 19 at the switches, and there's a wild train climbing up behind us." Edwards drew the lever, sanded the track, and the heavy train got underway again. But the whistles behind grew nearer, sounding danger signals, and in turning a curve, he looked out and saw a train speeding after him at a rate that must bring it against the rear of his own train if something was not done. He broke into a sweat as he pulled the throttle wide open and lunged into a snowbank. The car lurched, but the snow was flung off, and the train went roaring through another shed. Here was where the defective trail had been reported. No matter, a greater danger was pressing behind. The fireman piled on coal until his clothes were wet with perspiration, and fire belched from the smokestack. The passengers, too, having been warned of their peril, had dressed themselves and were anxiously watching at the window, for talk went among them that a mad engineer was driving the train behind. As Edwards crossed the summit, he shut off steam and surrendered his train to the force of gravity. Looking back, he could see the faint light from a new snow, that the driving wheels on the rear engine were bigger than his own, and that a tall figure stood atop of the cars and gestured frantically. At a sharp turn in the track, he found the other train but 200 yards behind him, and as he swept around the curve, the engineer who was chasing him leaned from his window and laughed. His face was like dough. Snow was falling and had begun to drift in the hollows, but the trains flew on. Bridges shook as they thundered across them. Wind screamed in the ears of the passengers. The suspected bridge was reached. Edward's heart was in his throat, but he seemed to clear the chasm by a bound. Now the switch was in sight, but number 19 was not there, and as the brakes were freed, the train shot by like a flash. Suddenly a red light appeared ahead, swinging to and fro on the track, as well to be run into behind as to crash into an obstacle ahead. He heard the whistle of the pursuing locomotive yelp behind him, yet he reversed the lever and put on brakes, and for a few seconds lived in a hell of dread. Hearing no sound now, he glanced back and saw the wild train almost leap upon his own. Yet just before it touched the tracks, seemed to spread. The engine toppled from the bank. The whole train rolled into the canyon and vanished. Edward shuddered and listened. No cry of hurt men or hiss of steam came up. Nothing but the groan of the wind as it rolled through the black depths. The lantern ahead, too, had disappeared. Now another danger impended, and there was no time to linger, for 19 might be on its way ahead if he did not reach the second switch before it moved out. The mad run was resumed, and the second switch was reached in time. As Edwards was finishing the run to Green River, which he reached in the morning ahead of schedule, he found written in the frost of his cab window were these words: "A freight train was wrecked, as you saw. Now that you saw it, you will never make another run. The engine was not under control, and 4 section men were killed. If you ever run on this road again, you will be wrecked. Edwards quit that road that morning and returned to Denver, found employment on the Union Pacific. No wreck was discovered the next day in the canyon where he'd seen it, nor had the phantom train been in chase of any engineer who has crossed the divide since that night. Well, my darlings, I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly think that Folklore Thursday will be my favorite day for narrating. So quoth this raven.